In the early 2000s, General Motors engineers were presented with a fix. The ignition switch in several small cars, including the Chevrolet Cobalt, the Saturn Ion, and related models, had a known problem. Under the right conditions, a heavy keychain, a bump in the road, a slight downward pressure on the key, the switch could slip out of the run position. When it did, the engine shut off. Drivers lost power-assisted steering, making the car much harder to control. Power-assisted brakes were disabled, and the airbags, which were wired to deploy only when the ignition was in the run position, were silently disabled. The fix cost less than $1 per vehicle. The engineers presented it. GM did not implement it. Over the next decade, at least 124 people died in crashes linked to that defective ignition switch, as determined by the Independent Compensation Fund GM later established. GM's own records show it knew about the ignition switch problem years before the recall and repeatedly discussed it without fixing it. For years, official reports and early narratives framed those deaths as driver error, not a hidden mechanical defect. This is the story of how the largest automaker in America turned a 57-cent engineering decision into a decade-long catastrophe, and what happened to the people who trusted that the car they were driving was safe. The ignition switch in the Chevrolet Cobalt was not a complicated piece of engineering. It was a small mechanical component with one job: to hold the key in the run position while the vehicle was in motion. It could not do that job. Beginning in the early 2000s, GM engineers and suppliers documented a specific failure mode. If a driver's keychain was heavy, a second key, a fob, a loyalty card, the additional weight could rotate the switch out of run and into accessory or off. The engine would shut down at highway speed. Drivers lost power-assisted steering, making the steering wheel much harder to turn. Power-assisted brakes were disabled, significantly reducing stopping ability. The car became extremely difficult to control. But the most lethal consequence was invisible to the driver. The airbag system in these vehicles was architecturally tied to the ignition. When the switch slipped to accessory or off, the car's electronics registered the vehicle as unpowered. In a crash occurring in that state, the airbags did not deploy. In some crashes which airbags might have rendered survivable, drivers and passengers died instead. Not because the airbags malfunctioned, because a 57-cent switch had silently disabled them before impact. For years, accident narratives focused on loss of control and driver behavior. The internal documents, examined later, showed GM had long recognized an ignition defect that could cause exactly those crashes. What happened to the families who lost someone was not a mistake in isolation. It was the downstream consequence of a decision made years earlier about a part that cost less than $1. Understanding how that decision was made requires going back to the beginning and to the name of the engineer who approved it. In the early 2000s, a supplier proposed a redesigned ignition switch with a higher torque specification, meaning it would require significantly more force to rotate out of the run position. Internal documents later cited a cost difference of about 57 cents per vehicle. GM chose not to adopt the redesign. The engineer who approved the original switch specification was Ray DiGiorgio. When deposed years later, DiGiorgio testified that he did not know why the switch specification had been quietly changed in 2006, upgraded to a higher torque version, without a formal engineering order and without changing the part number. That last detail matters, because GM used the same part number for both the old switch and the new one. Investigators initially could not determine which cars had which version installed. The concealment was not designed. It was inherited from a process that had never been required to account for it. The Chevrolet Cobalt launched mid-decade with the defective switch installed. Within months, field reports began arriving. Dealers noted stalls. Engineers logged complaints about keys rotating out of position. By the mid-2000s, internal documents showed the ignition switch did not meet GM's own specifications. The problem was classified as a customer convenience issue, not a safety defect, not a recall candidate. The same classification used for rattling cup holders. Meanwhile, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the federal regulator responsible for vehicle safety, received complaints about the Cobalt stalling as early as 2007. An investigation was opened, then closed without action. The regulatory system that was supposed to catch what GM's internal processes missed also failed to catch it. The paper trail was accumulating, the death toll was climbing, and the organizational structure that had produced the original decision kept grinding toward the same result. But the full picture of how that happened would only become clear when GM's own investigators finally put it in writing. In 2014, facing congressional scrutiny and mounting media investigations, GM commissioned attorney Anton Valukas to conduct an independent internal review. The Valukas report ran 325 pages. Its conclusion was specific and carefully worded. There was no organized conspiracy. What existed instead was a pattern of management deficiency and misjudgment. Years of engineers, lawyers, and executives who saw the problem, documented it, discussed it in committees, and did not fix it. The report gave names to two behaviors that characterized how the dysfunction operated. The GM nod. People in meetings nodded in apparent agreement, but left with no intention of taking action or accepting ownership. The GM salute. A crossed arms gesture that communicated that a problem belonged to someone else. According to Valukas, these were not aberrations. They were cultural patterns, ways an organization had learned to process problems without resolving them. Field reports were submitted and buried. Safety committees examined the switch and walked away. Engineers who raised concerns were not silenced. They were absorbed into a process that was never designed to produce a recall. At no point did Valukas find a memo ordering, "Do not recall this vehicle." The structure of the organization made that explicit instruction unnecessary. That conclusion is more disturbing than a conspiracy. A conspiracy requires intent. What the Valukas report described was a system that had learned to normalize death through routine organizational dysfunction. The external pressure that finally forced the recall did not come from inside GM. It came from a wrongful death lawsuit filed on behalf of Brooke Melton, a 29-year-old nurse who died in March 2010 when her Chevrolet Cobalt lost power and drifted across the center line on a Georgia highway. Her family hired attorney Lance Cooper. During discovery, Cooper obtained GM's own engineering documents and found something GM had never disclosed. The ignition switch specification had been changed in 2006, but the part number had never been updated. GM had installed a different part in newer vehicles while maintaining the same part number, meaning the defect in older cars was traceable to a specific engineering decision that had been quietly corrected without acknowledgement. Cooper later stated, "The discovery showed GM knew the switch was defective and fixed it without telling anyone." That lawsuit, more than any internal review, was what forced the recall open. When GM announced the recall in February 2014, the company acknowledged 13 deaths linked to the ignition switch defect. 13. Congressional investigators, journalists, and victim advocates immediately challenged that number. A Reuters investigation identified at least 74 deaths in crashes with patterns consistent with the ignition defect before GM's numbers had risen at all. GM appointed Kenneth Feinberg, the attorney who had administered the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, to run an independent claims process. His mandate was specific: evaluate each death and injury claim against a defined standard, and determine whether the crash could be credibly linked to the ignition switch defect. The final number from Feinberg's review was 124 confirmed deaths and 275 injuries. GM had initially acknowledged 13. The independent review found 124. The difference between those two numbers represents what a decade of organizational dysfunction actually cost, measured in human lives. There is one more number that matters. Out of 4,342 claims submitted to Feinberg's fund, 3,938 were rejected as ineligible, 91%. Given that rejection rate, critics argued the legal framework was better optimized to limit liability than to recognize every possible victim. The people who believed the defective switch had killed or injured someone they loved were told, in 9 out of 10 cases, that their claim did not qualify. The families received a process. Most of them did not receive an answer, and the structure that had protected GM inside the company was about to protect it in a different arena entirely. In 2009, General Motors filed for bankruptcy. The company that emerged was legally structured as a new entity. Old GM, the company that had built the defective switches, classified the deaths as customer convenience issues and declined to implement the 57-cent fix, was a separate legal entity. New GM purchased old GM's assets through the bankruptcy process. When victims and families attempted to sue General Motors for deaths caused by the defective switch, they encountered the bankruptcy shield. New GM's position was that it could not be held liable for decisions made by old GM. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals eventually ruled that concealment of the defect during the bankruptcy process raised due process concerns that limited GM's protection. But the structure delayed accountability by years and reduced total liability significantly. The $120 million settlement over lost vehicle value, covering millions of owners whose cars had been recalled, was funded partly by New GM, which contributed up to $70 million, and partly by a trust tied to the old GM bankruptcy, which contributed $50 million. No individual GM executives were criminally prosecuted over the ignition switch defect. The company entered a $900 million criminal resolution with the Department of Justice in 2015. The corporation paid. The individuals who made the decisions, including the engineer who approved the original switch, the managers who classified the problem as a convenience issue, the committees that reviewed and walked away, did not. Mary Barra became CEO of General Motors in January 2014, weeks before the ignition switch recall was announced. She testified before Congress that spring. Her public statements included a direct acknowledgement that became the face of GM's response: "We accept responsibility." Barra acknowledged the deaths. She acknowledged the internal failures documented in the Valukas report. She committed to the Victim Compensation Fund. She described what had happened inside GM as a failure of culture, of process, of accountability. What she did not explain, what no one at General Motors explained, was why a decade of documented field reports, engineer complaints, and internal safety reviews had produced no action. The Valukas report called it management deficiency. Barra called it unacceptable. Neither answer fully accounts for 124 people who died in crashes where the airbags did not deploy. By the early 2000s, GM engineers had documented ignition switch problems and proposed a fix at a cost of about 57 cents per vehicle. Over the next decade, 124 people died in crashes linked to the faulty switch, vehicles where the defect silently disabled airbags before impact. GM's own investigation found no conspiracy, just years of organizational dysfunction that functioned exactly like one. The families of those 124 people did not get a conspiracy. They got a compensation fund that rejected 91% of claims. They got a $900 million fine paid by a corporation. They got a recall, a decade after the defect was first documented. They did not get the 57 cents. Now let's talk about this in the comments. By the early 2000s, GM engineers documented ignition switch problems and proposed a fix. The cost difference was about 57 cents per vehicle. GM did not implement it. Over the next decade, 124 people died in crashes linked to the faulty switch. GM's own investigation found no conspiracy, just years of organizational dysfunction that functioned exactly like one. No individual executives were criminally prosecuted. The corporation paid $900 million and continued operations. Was that justice? Or did the system work exactly as it was designed to? And second, GM filed for bankruptcy in 2009. The legal structure that emerged was later used to limit victims' claims. The people who made the decisions that contributed to 124 deaths were shielded by a corporate restructuring that happened years before the recall. Is that how accountability is supposed to work? What would it actually look like if individuals were held responsible? Drop your answer below. Subscribe to Blunder. We cover the collapses they'd rather you forget.